Now we are on chapter 35, and on Wednesday we got down through verse 6. So we'll pick up verse 7 tonight, and this is the trip to Bethel. And once they get there, verse 7 says, "And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother." And it's interesting, El Bethel can be translated two different ways. It's God of the house of God, or you could just say the God of Bethel. Either way, definitely God is the God there. Now, what's rather interesting about Jacob's naming this place El Bethel, God of the house of God, or the God of Bethel, however you want to look at it. Jacob has already realized that no matter where he had gone, God was with him, but he still seems to have in his head that sort of like God's home, if you will, is there at Bethel. That the house of God, or God's headquarters, is at Bethel. And now that he's back in Bethel, that he's back in God's good graces. He's physically present there in the, with God. Not just that God could go with him other places. Now he's back in God's, personal presence at this location. I don't think at this point it still has quite dawned on Jacob that God doesn't just follow him around, that God is literally everywhere. He apparently still hadn't quite understood that concept yet. Now, verse 8, it says, "Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died." Now, you recall Rebekah is Jacob's mother, the one who had actually sent Jacob to go live with Laban over 20 years previously. Now, since they had lived in Shechem for, we don't know for sure, anywhere from a few months to possibly a year or two, plus the amount of time that it took them to get from Haran, south, meet up with Esau, and then work their way over to Shechem, we're looking at potentially a year or two's time. So 21, 22 years later, minimum. And you'll notice that all during this time, Rebekah has nowhere been mentioned. When Rebekah sent him to go live with Laban, I think there was an expectation that he'd stay there for a few months, a year or two, wait for Esau to cool down, and come back home. Apparently by this point, Rebekah has at some point died and never saw her son again. Now, the reason I think we can make an assumption here that Rebekah has died, even though we're nowhere told anything about Rebekah at this point, says Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died. One of the questions you would want to ask yourself is, why was Deborah, if she had been Rebekah's nurse, why was she there with Jacob's entourage unless Rebekah has already died? So that's kind of the general consensus of opinion of most commentators, that Rebekah's gone already. But we don't have any idea how long before that may have happened. But now, as for why Deborah has joined the party at this point, we don't know, because keep in mind, Isaac and Rebekah, their home was still about another 30 or 40 miles even farther south than this. But for whatever reason, Deborah has joined, and said, "And she was buried below Bethel under the oak. It was named Alon Bakuth, which means the oak of weeping. Now, where have you heard this particular oak before? What's that?
That's like Abraham's oak.
Well,
She was in a cave.
yeah, Abraham buried Sarah in a cave near the what's called the Oak of Mamre. But it was near Bethel. So it's a possibility, and many commentators believe this may have been the same location, and that it had by this point become the family burial plot. But we are told more about that later on down the line in this, later in, I believe, it's either this chapter or the next one. Verse 9 says, Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram, and he blessed him. And God said to him, Your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Now this is the second time that God has appeared to him and told him, your name's not Jacob anymore. It's Israel. Thus he called him Israel. Now from this point forward, there are a few scattered references to Jacob being called Israel, but for the most part, every time from here forward that we have a reference to Jacob as simply being who he is, an individual, all the way through the rest of Genesis, even though God has renamed him at this point. For example, when Joseph is later sold into slavery, several years after that, the whole family moves to Egypt. They still are calling him Jacob, but it's with respect to him as an individual. Anytime we have a reference to him as the family patriarch, in other words, the forefather of all the 12 brothers, then the 12 tribes, in those situations, in the context of him being basically the patriarch of the nation, he's called then Israel. All right, thus he called him Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. Now, most of you in here, whether you realize it or not, know the term for God Almighty. Anybody want to guess what it is? We sing about it quite frequently. El Shaddai. Now, see, I told you you'd heard it before. Yeah, if you hear the term or hear a song or anything about El Shaddai, that's literally what that is. That is God Almighty. So what God said here is that I am El Shaddai. Now, notice in this context how God presents it. He didn't say my name is or anything like that. Notice what he said. I am El Shaddai. Merrill caught it. I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. And says, be fruitful and multiply. Now, previously, this command was given to humanity in general. We have there's 3 times previous to this that God gave the command to be fruitful and multiply. Does anybody know when they were?
Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden is 1.
Kicked out of the Garden of Eden.
Kicked out of the Garden of Eden is 2.
Noah and his sons.
Noah and his sons. Well, you're on a roll tonight. Yeah, Noah and his sons were told, be fruitful and multiply. Well, now, God is specifically telling Jacob, as the family patriarch, be fruitful and multiply. Now, Jacob's already had all the kids he's going to have at this point. We definitely know he didn't have any other sons. If he had any other daughters, we're simply not told about it. But in all probability, he's had all the kids he's going to have. So why would God be telling him at this point to be fruitful and multiply.
As a nation?
As a nation, remember, Jacob is the national patriarch. So God is giving him the command that would then be passed down to his kids, that all of them would be fruitful and multiply. Now, it's been 3,000 years since this particular event occurred. Has it ever, you ever wondered why no matter how many times people have tried to stamp out the Jews, they keep coming back? They're God's chosen people, and He's issued the command that they would multiply. Everywhere they've gone, even when God Himself weeded them out because of their disobedience, God's always given the promise that He would save a remnant, and then what happens to the remnant? They multiply all over again.
Just like rabbits.
Well, I don't know if I'd go quite that far. All right. So be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. Well, this is God Himself telling Jacob that he's going to have, royalty descending from him. It said, the land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give it to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. Now, notice at this point, Jacob is in Bethel. And we know where, even today, where Bethel is. Bethel is still Bethel. It's in kind of south central Israel. South of, actually it's a little bit north of Jerusalem, but in the overall territory of Israel, it's kind of in the south central. We don't think of Jerusalem as being southern Israel or anything, but at that time, when you consider, Canaan from north to south, Bethel was actually south of what should have been the center part of the country. The only reason Jerusalem is kind of right in the middle today is because of their lack of obedience of occupying all of what was Canaan. But if you look on a map of ancient Canaan before it became Israel, Bethel is actually south of the central part of what was Canaan at the time. But anyway, where I'm going with this is God promised it to them at this particular point. He promised it to Abraham. He promised it to Isaac. Now we have all of the Arabs today that also claim descendancy from Abraham and say, well, we are the children of Abraham. The land belongs to us. But biblically, this eliminates any potential of confusion, because look who God is promising that land to now. Jacob and his descendants, not Ishmael, not any of the Arabs. So the argument today, it's interesting that, who was it that just had mentioned that Palestine is, the so-called Palestinian. By the way, if you go back about 60 or 70 years and do a little research, you know how many Palestinians there were, say, 80 years ago? None. They're only claiming to be that for political purposes, but the bottom line is God promised this land not to the Arabs or any Palestinian, but to Jacob's descendants. This is Jewish land.
Wasn't Palestine created by the British?
It was kind of called that even before the British got involved in it, all during the time of the Arab occupation. Even during the time of the Roman Empire, the Romans referred to it as Palestine. But as far as God's concerned, that land is Israel. All right, we go a couple more verses and we'll close to being done for the night. All right. Verse 13. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. Now,
That
notice
means that God was in his presence. God wasn't speaking to him from heaven.
apparently not.
So he was interacting with Jesus.
More than likely. But notice also where they were. They were at Bethel. What happened the last time Jacob was at Bethel?
He had a vision from God.
Yeah. He laid down on a rock and had a weird dream. I wonder what laying on rocks will do for you. Had this weird dream that was the house of God and that angels were ascending and descending in that area. So he gets back to Bethel, and what's the next thing that happens to him? God appears to him again. Doesn't just speak to him. As Merrill just mentioned, apparently God appeared to him because it says God went up from him. So God didn't just speak from heaven. Apparently he had another interaction with God. So it spoken to him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured out a libation on it. He also poured oil on it. Now this is the first time that we see this kind of an offering given. It's by no means the first time that they've set up an altar or put up some kind of a memorial pillar or pile of rocks or something to indicate that this is the place where we encountered God. But this is the first indication that we have of somebody actually pouring out a drink offering to God.
Didn't he set up the first time he was there, he also set up an altar to him? Right?
He did. Now, where in the area it was, we don't know. And it's also possible that he may have done this again because, well, he'd been gone for, 22, 23 years. It's highly possible that the one he had left there before could have been, well, I don't think necessarily would have disintegrated, but it could have been kicked over or, busted down by somebody else. Because remember what it was made out of. It was made out of rocks.
Yeah.
So, good possibility it may not have been there anymore, and so he makes himself another one. But he'd also been told to make one. So Jacob named the place where God had spoken with him Bethel, which again means the house of God. So he called it Bethel before. It was the town of Luz. Now since Jacob had moved on and went on to Haran, it's doubtful that any of the locals, we had this guy that was just passing through said this place is called Bethel now. So, common sense tells us that the locals continued probably calling it Luz. But he gets back several years later, then calls it El Bethel, and now it says that he's named it Bethel again, the house of God. Apparently that's what it stayed from that point on was Bethel, because also at this point, Jacob kind of sets up shop here. This is where he stays for the duration at this point, at least until they leave from here and end up going to Egypt. So he stayed there for a while. Between verse 15 and verse 16, we're not really sure how much long that was. I'm not going to get into it, but let me just read verse 16 and we'll stop there. It says, Then they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and by the way, does anybody know where Ephrath is?
That's Bethlehem, isn't it?
That is another word. That is the early name for Bethlehem. Yes, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. Now, I don't want to get into the birth of Benjamin yet at this point, because that's going to take us a little bit to talk about that. But now, how long they were at Bethel before they left and went on to what became Bethlehem, we're not really sure. I would venture to say they were probably there for several months. And I'll give you two reasons why that's a possibility. They were there long enough that his renaming of this place Bethel stuck. Because if he'd have just passed on through, would the locals have just arbitrarily changed the name of the town because some guy passing through said so? No. He had to stay there long enough that it became common knowledge that he had renamed it. The other reason I believe, or tend to believe, that they were there for a while is verse 16. Said as soon as they began traveling again, and from Bethel to Bethlehem, maybe another 20 or 25 miles tops. But at that point, clearly, Rachel is probably getting very close to or at 9 months pregnancy. If she had been pregnant prior to that, we don't have any indication of that at all. There's no mention at all of her being pregnant, obviously with Benjamin, until we get to verse 16. So I think the general consensus is they were probably at Bethel for at least several months. Let me mention this one thing and we'll be done. Because you may, especially I know you ladies are going to wonder, why in the world would Jacob, strike out on yet another trip if his wife was 9 months pregnant? Where do you think, so far, 11 out of Jacob's 12 sons were born in Haran. Benjamin is the only one born in Canaan. His mother has probably died at this point. His mother's nurse has died at this point. What would motivate him to take his 9-month pregnant wife, that he would put her on a camel and say, we gotta keep going?
So he would be born where Jacob came from.
Bingo. He wants Benjamin to be born near the family homestead.
Anchor baby?
Anchor baby. All right, questions this evening? All right, Mario, all yours.